Hey guys, it's Tara Marie. I'm here at the Hangar Studios with New York Times bestselling author Johann Hari. We're talking about his book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Johann, I know that rates of depression and anxiety are at an all-time high, and I think we're missing the mark.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it all with you, Tara.
Well, stick with us. We'll be right back. I'm Tara Marie, and I'm a fitness expert, personal trainer, and motivational strategist. Optimal health is achieved when you're balanced mentally, emotionally, physically, socially, and spiritually. My goal is to bring you information that will help you be the best version of you. Well, hello and welcome to Tara Marie Live. I'm your host, Tara Marie Segundo, and I'm a fitness expert, a personal trainer, and a motivational strategist. We're broadcasting today from the Hangar Studios in New York City. Tara Marie Live is about mental, emotional, physical, social, and spiritual health, and today we're exploring a topic that demonstrates how inextricably linked these facets of us are. We're talking about depression and anxiety. The United States is in the middle of an unprecedented epidemic of depression and anxiety. Every single year for the past 30 years, depression and anxiety have increased. And today they're at an epidemic level. 1 in 3 women is now on antidepressants, and male life expectancy is falling for the first time in peacetime history of the U.S. because of suicide. Why is this happening to us? What is going on, and what should we do about it? My guest today has written a beautiful new book about this very topic, and in it he asks, what are the real causes of depression and anxiety, and what are the real solutions? Please welcome my guest, Johann Hari. He's the New York Times bestselling author of Chasing the Scream, which has been published in 11 languages and is being adapted into a fictional feature film and a feature-length documentary. He was twice named Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International UK for his reporting on the war in Congo and human rights abuses in Dubai. He's written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and he's a regular panelist on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. His TED Talk, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, has more than 21 million views. Welcome.
Hey, good to be with you, Tara.
You came here from London?
No, I haven't been in London in months.
Where have you been?
California, Arizona, loads of other places.
And you're doing research now for a new project?
Yeah. The expensive bit of the work I do is the travel, so I tend to research a few things at the same time. So about to go and spend a load of time in Vegas for something I'm researching about that city that I'm not meant to talk about. So I'm excited to be here. And
I told you before we went on the air that I lived in London.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit of a London fanatic. I love you. You people are it was a lovely experience. It was many years ago. It was between October of 1991 and April of 1992. So it was during the bad weather. It was during you know that. And I told you I lived in central London, and we may have crossed paths because I was right there in central London off Marylebone High Street.
Yeah, I love London so much. I remember going back to London. I might be getting some of the dates wrong here, but in my memory, I remember I was here for about 6 months in the run-up to the election of President Trump, and I remember going back to London and, arriving back. Maybe I've got these dates wrong and this is my imagination, but certainly these events happen in some order. And getting back and, not long after I got back from one trip to the US, that landing on the day that the Muslim mayor of London led the gay pride parade. And I remember thinking, my God, this is like heaven. And we've landed back in this place where
it's a brand new world.
People get along and the world works. And it's very different to but London is of course being dragged down by the general collapse of the entire world that's going on at the moment because of Brexit and everything. But yeah, I love London is a place where, I always think about the incredible factor. I might be getting the figures slightly wrong, but when we had those terrible subway bombings in London in 2005, there were, if I remember rightly, there were 51 victims, not including the bombers, and something like 25 countries lost a citizen. That's how global London is, right?
Love it. I loved living there. And you still are based there, correct? Pretty much?
I'm there about half the year, but I was there like 5 months of the last year.
Okay. So you're based there, but you travel. You basically
I'm in the US about half the year as well.
Well, it's good to have you. And I want to hold up this book. I loved reading. I read every word of this book. And I say that sincerely. People may say that and they may just they may have read through it. I read literally every word of this book, and the praises for it have been amazing. Hillary Clinton says, a wonderful and incisive analysis of the depression and alienation that are haunting American society. And I was eager to read this book because I've struggled myself with depression and anxiety. So many people I know have. And I was really eager to hear what you had to say. And I wanted to just get right into it. People need to know that you're not a physician. You're not a therapist. You're a best-selling author. You're a journalist who travels the world talking to the brightest minds of any given field. And then you spend years doing that. And then you compile your findings into very insightful books.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I had a training in the social sciences at Cambridge University, and I tried to use both that and journalism to try to get to the bottom of this. And with this book, Lost Connections, I wrote it because there were really these two kind of mysteries that were hanging over me. The first mystery is, and you alluded to it in your intro, Tara, I'm 40 years old. Every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased here in the United States and across the Western world. And I wanted to understand, like you said, what's happening to us,
what the
right?
Hell? Yeah.
Why is this? I mean, we're meeting just a week after it was announced that we now have the highest level of suicide in the entire history of this country. And that doesn't include opioid deaths, which are a whole other thing on top of that. More people have now died in the opioid crisis than all the Americans who died in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. And so I wanted to understand, why are so many people surrounding us so many more people around us with each year that passes finding it harder and harder to get through the day?
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand that also because of a more personal mystery. When I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor. I think the way I put it then was that I had a feeling like pain was leaking out of me and I couldn't control it. I couldn't regulate it. I didn't understand what was going on. I felt quite ashamed of it. And my doctor at that time told me a story. This is the late 90s. Lots of people were being told this story by their doctors, because this is what doctors were being told, that I now realise it wasn't totally untrue, but was really oversimplified. My doctor said, we know why people feel like this. Some people just naturally have something wrong with their brains. Either you've got a chemical imbalance, or you're lacking a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. All we need to do to fix this is give you this drug. The one he gave me was Paxil, which is, or Seroxat, as it's sometimes marketed. And so you're going to be fine. And I remember feeling a tremendous amount of relief at being told this story.
Sure, because you had an explanation, finally.
Exactly, I understood what was happening. And also, I remember getting a really significant boost from this drug. And then a couple of months later, this feeling of pain came back. So I went back to my doctor. He said, clearly I didn't give you a high enough dose. Again, I was given a high dose. Again, I felt better. Again, this feeling a bit faster this time. This feeling of pain came back. So again, I went back, and I was in this cycle of being given higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum possible dose you're legally allowed to take. I was experiencing all sorts of horrible side effects, and more importantly, I was still depressed.
And as you said in the book, at first it would provide you some relief, and you thought, "Oh, okay, this is it. We found that this was it. It was a wrong dose issue." Yeah,
but over time, and I was surprised to discover I was quite typical in that. Not everyone has this experience, but actually this is the norm. So at the end of that, I was thinking, well, what's going wrong here? Because I'm doing everything that I'm being told to do according to the story that my doctor and my culture is telling me about depression.
Right.
And yet I still feel like shit, right? So I decided to go on this long journey to try to understand these two mysteries, to try to get to the bottom of these two mysteries. So I ended up going over 40,000 miles. I wanted to sit with the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, but also just people with very different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that helped. And I learned obviously a huge number of things, but I think at the heart of what I learned is that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. Two of them are indeed in our biology. Your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems. They don't write your fate, but they can make you more sensitive to it. And there are real changes that happen in your brain when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety, for which there's very good scientific evidence, are not in our biology. Most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are in the way we're living. And once you understand that, you can understand, firstly, why it's going up, because human biology didn't suddenly change in the last 40 years.
That's what I was going to point out. If our genetic makeup hasn't altered that much, why have the rates changed so much? That's why we have to ask ourselves.
Exactly. There's got to be something else going on. Actually, turns out there's very good scientific evidence for what else is going on. But also, once you understand the real range of causes, that opens up a whole different set of solutions that I saw people pursuing, including some brilliant doctors all over the world, that should be offered to people as part of an expanded menu alongside the option of chemical antidepressants.
Well, I wondered when I read in the book about how, at first you would go in, get a higher dose, it would work for a little while, go in, get a higher dose. Before you decided to embark on this journey trying to figure out what the heck is going on, did it at first occur to you, like, what's wrong with me? Why isn't this working? Because this is supposed to work.
Yeah, that's exactly that's really well put. That's exactly what I thought.
And you're a teen. And how old are you at the time? Like when
I started, I was 18 or 19, and then when I stopped, I was in my 30s. So all my entire adult life, I had been on these drugs. And I want to stress, I did get some relief from them initially. So I wanted to look at, there were a few aspects of there were lots of painful parts of this journey, difficult things to learn. One of the hardest, because there's this moment, how would I put it? When you've got a story about your pain, even when that story is not working very well for you, at least you feel like you know where you are. It's like your pain is like a wild animal and the story puts it on a leash. And there's a moment when that story slips away from you where you feel like the animal's been taken off the leash. It feels really frightening. And I had a moment in this. Of course, it led me to much more positive experiences and solutions and stories. But yeah, that was very difficult. So I guess there were a few aspects about antidepressants that were thinking about chemical antidepressants, which I'm not opposed to, and it's important to stress.
And by the way, I was put on one too.
Yeah, and what was your experience, Tara?
My experience, I was put on one, and it was exactly as you relayed in the book. That's why and by the way, I feel like everybody who's suffered with depression and anxiety should read this book, but I also feel like everybody else should too, because I feel like amongst the people who have suffered, we understand what we're talking about. But for people who have never suffered, those lucky people, I think they don't get it. I really don't think they understand it. It's almost like this should be recommended or required reading in high school or something, because I feel like that's when kids start to go off. That's when I started to go off. My director's nodding. I feel like in high school, it was high school for you, it was high school for me. I feel like in high school is where people start to go off if they're going to. And what's scary about it is you don't understand what's happening. That was what was so scary for you, as I understood from what you said in the book. It was frightening to you because, So for me, there was a precipitating event. A horrible precipitating event in my life. So I got carted off to the doctor and I got put on an antidepressant.
Do you feel comfortable saying what that was?
The antidepressant?
What the precipitating event was.
Okay, perfect example. And you'll understand this because it has to do with loss, as you so eloquently describe in the book. So I had gotten married to someone who was I was living in New York, and I married someone who was in another state. And he was actually where my family lives in Tampa. And that's how I met him, was from being in Tampa so much because I was down there visiting my family. And when we decided to get married, it seemed like I was going to have to uproot the life that I had so perfectly, laid out in New York with all the hopes and dreams for my career and everything I ever wanted. It looked like in order to marry him, I was going to have to move my life to Tampa. And no knock against Tampa. Tampa's a lovely place, but for me and what I wanted to do with my life, it felt like the end of my life. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It just felt like the end of my life as I knew it or as I had planned it to be. And in order to marry him, that was what we were going to do. And I slumped into a depression because I felt like my life on many levels was over. And I was like 36 years old. And so I just became deeply depressed because I didn't know myself anymore. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think this relates to so much of the evidence.
I did what I had to do in order to be in this relationship, and I left my beloved New York, but I also left behind who I used to be and who I planned on being and who I wanted to be and what I wanted for my future. And I didn't know myself anymore. I didn't know what my future looked like, as you talk about in the book. I had no idea of what the picture was going to look like, and what I could fathom, it didn't make me happy. And so I got carted off to a psychiatrist. They put me on an antidepressant. And it's just a chemical Band-Aid, but like you said, that didn't solve the problems.
So you found that your depression came back after a while, or
it kind of never went away.
Right.
What finally made it go away was the relationship ended. Then we went through a sad divorce, which is also very depressing. But what happened is after the divorce, then I was back in New York, back to me, and I was like, well, I'm just going to do me. So you radically changed your environment, and that dealt with your depression. I went back to the life I wanted.
Right. That's. I mean, as you know, that relates to so many aspects of the book. That there's evidence for 3 kinds of cause of depression and anxiety, and they play out to some degree in everyone who has depression or anxiety, different levels. So there are biological causes like the genes, brain changes. There are psychological causes, how you think about yourself, things like childhood trauma. And then there are environmental causes, which are, the way we live with each other.
And that's the biopsychosocial model that you talk about?
Yeah, that's the kind of fancy term for it. Yeah. And I think you can see how those things interact in your story. But just to go back to that stuff about, very little of the book is about chemical antidepressants, but I think it was important for me to go through that, thinking about that journey that you and I went through, of being told. So were you told this is a problem in your brain as well? Is that how your doctor explained it to you?
Well, it was obvious. I explained to the doctor that I was deeply unhappy, that I felt like I was living in a retirement community. Do you know what I mean? I'm a young 36-year-old girl who I had this whole idea of what I wanted my life to be in New York. And I felt like it wasn't necessarily true, but it felt like I was going to live in a retirement community. Right. Compared to New York, that's what it felt like. Yeah. And so the doctor understood that I was miserable, but all he did, we didn't do any talk therapy. We did nothing. All he did was he prescribed me pills.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was quite shocking...
And that's what happened to you.
Yeah, and it's what happened to millions of people.
Yeah.
And I want to stress again, there's some value to the pills. We can actually measure that. So you've got to separate out a few things. First is, the story that is often told alongside the pills is much more problematic than the pills itself. Okay. So it was really shocking to speak to some of the leading experts in the world and be told there is no evidence that depression is caused by low serotonin or by a spontaneous chemical imbalance in the brain. Mm-hmm. So the leading expert at Princeton, Professor Andrew Scull, explains, the phrase he uses is, it's deeply misleading and unscientific to say depression is caused by low serotonin. One of the leading experts in Europe, Dr. David Healy, said to me, you can't even say that story has been discredited because it was never credited. There was never a time when half of the scientists in the field would have told you that depression was just caused by low serotonin.
Why were we told that then?
Because that's the story that the drug companies figured out was the best way to market these drugs to us, right? There were some scientists who believed it, but that was not most of the scientific field. Uh-huh. That doesn't mean there's no value to these drugs, and we can measure the value to these drugs. So depression is generally measured by something called the Hamilton scale.
Okay.
I've always felt really sorry for whoever Hamilton was, that we only remember him by how miserable we all are. But anyway, and the Hamilton scale goes, to give you a sense of it, from 1, where you would be dancing around in joy, to 51, where you would be acutely suicidal. To give you a sense of movement on the Hamilton scale, if you improve your sleep patterns, you'll generally gain about 6 points on the Hamilton scale. Mm. And if your sleep patterns deteriorate, you'll lose 6 points on average on the Hamilton scale. So, according to the leading expert at Harvard Medical School, Professor Irving Kirsch, who got hold of all the studies, including the ones the drug companies didn't want us to see, on average, over time, chemical antidepressants will move you 1.8 points on the Hamilton scale. It's a bit less than a third of improving your sleep patterns. Some people say Dr. Kirsch underestimates the evidence from the data. They say it's about 3 points.
Okay.
So the upper estimate is that it's about half of improving your sleep patterns. It's important to say a few things about that. Firstly, that's an average. Some people will get more, some people will get less.
Okay.
I initially got more and over time got less. Also important to say 1.8 points ain't nothing, right? If you're acutely suicidal, that might be the thing that gets you down off the bridge. But you can also see 1.8 points is not going to solve the problem for most people. Helps us to understand why we look around us. Every year for the last 40 years, we've increased chemical antidepressant prescriptions, and yet depression is continuing to rise. It's not rising because of the drugs. The drugs are taking the edge off for some people, but there's something missing from this story. What's missing from the story is what's actually causing the problem.
You know what I just thought of when you said that every time they would bump your dose, you'd get a little bump? You talk a huge section in the book, you talk about the placebo effect. I wonder if that bump was a bump, or it was because you said in the book, the first time you put the pill in your mouth, you called it a chemical kiss. Like, it's like the second you dropped it on your tongue, you went, because you believed it.
So it's important to stress the best evidence on this. There is some placebo effect, but there is good evidence that chemical antidepressants have more than a placebo effect in the first few months.
Okay.
The gap isn't that big, but it's a significant gap, right? It's a real gap.
Okay.
So some of it's placebo, but some of it is a real effect. But I think the most important evidence when it comes to chemical antidepressants is something called the STAR-D trial. Very simple. It just follows people who go to their doctor and say, I'm depressed, give me help. And it follows them over time to see do they become depressed again, depending on what happens to them. And what that found is most people given chemical antidepressants do become depressed again. Doesn't mean they're not given some relief. Doesn't mean the stuff about the Hamilton scale isn't right. It is. It doesn't mean there's not some value to these drugs. There is. But again, it reinforces what you learned, what I learned from our personal experience. We weren't so weird, right? Actually, we were the norm.
You got to fix your life.
That felt very... This is the one thing I had been offered, right?
Yeah.
As help. And to be told it has some effect, but it's probably not going to solve your problem, I found really destabilizing. And one of the people who helped me to see the way through that back to the much more positive message of the book, which I think is overwhelmingly positive, that there's real hope, there's this incredible science.
Oh, there's
all
a
these
lot
solutions.
you can do, yeah.
I went to interview this South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield, who told me a story that really helped me to think differently about this. So Dr. Summerfield happened to be in Cambodia in Southeast Asia, where in 2001, when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs, so they were like, what are they? And he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And Derek was like, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy, right? Like John's wort, ginkgo biloba, something like that. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields, and one day he stood on a landmine left over by the war with the United States, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg, and he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial leg. I'm guessing it was pretty traumatic for obvious reasons. The guy starts to cry all day, doesn't want to get out of bed, refuses to get out of bed after a while. It develops classic depression.
Because his life doesn't make sense anymore, yeah.
Well, when they were explaining this to Dr. Summerfield, the Cambodian doctor said, well, that is when we gave him an antidepressant. And he's like, what was it?
What'd you get? Yeah.
They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realised that his pain made sense, that it had causes in his life that were entirely understandable. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant.
Yeah.
That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that it's entirely or primarily a biological problem with your brain.
Yes.
That sounds like a bad joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow.
Yeah.
But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, your pain makes sense. You're not weak. You're not primarily a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical support to get your deeper needs met. So a big part of what I'm asking in my book, Lost Connections, is, okay, what's the cow for the things that are screwing us up? Now, our problems are usually more complex than this guy's, but it turns out there are loads of cows for the problems that we have. But I think this relates to, a way of framing your depression and understanding depression of a lot of people, in fact, I would argue most people, the vast majority of depressed and anxious people, is it's not the only thing that's going on. I want to stress that, but I think it's the biggest thing. It's the reason why it's rising. Everyone listening to your show knows that they've got natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. These sounds like all the things you were deprived of in Tampa.
I couldn't see a future. I didn't see a future because it wasn't what I had planned. Yeah,
exactly. And this culture we've built is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today. You know, I'm a gay man. I'm glad to be alive in 2019. I had to go to the dentist last week. I'm glad to be alive in 2019.
Right.
But we have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And it's not the only thing that's going on, but I think it helps us to understand why we're having these epidemics of despair, suicide, depression, anxiety, addiction, and why are they clustering in the same places? I would also argue rising political extremism, which also clustering in the same places.
I just thought of something. I wanted to ask you. So this is a little off topic, but I've got to ask this because it was the first thing I thought of after I finished your book. Your prior book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And I told Rich, our director, I told him about that title. He loved the title, right? Chasing the Scream. I've worked with addicts, primarily food addicts, believe it or not, but I've known people who have had drug addicts in their families, and I know what that does to a family. I've always felt, as I've observed things, that addiction and anxiety and depression are like cousins, if not siblings. And I wondered if you almost lump the addiction epidemic together with the depression and anxiety epidemic, and if that's possibly why you followed Chasing the Scream with this book.
Yeah, the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be.
Right.
It's a way of not being present. People with food addiction,
yes,
you see that, right? You see the moment in which you are gorging.
Yes.
It's a moment in which you're not present with your pain, right?
Yes.
It's not a good coping strategy for all the reasons we're talking about, but for many people, it's the best one that their life has offered them up to that point. The best study of, look, think about the opioid crisis. I've been to the places, some of the epicenters of the opioid crisis, like Monadnock, New Hampshire. It's not a coincidence. The places where the opioid crisis is worst are also the places where depression that isn't related to opioids is worse, where suicide that's not by opioids is worse, right? You don't have to spend long in those places to see these people, through no fault of their own, have been deprived of the things that make life meaningful. They've been placed into... If you want to understand why people are taking so many painkillers, you've got to understand why they're in such deep pain. And all the 9 causes that I go through in Lost Connections that contribute to depression and anxiety are huge drivers of the opioid crisis and wider addiction problems.
Okay.
So these are densely interconnected.
So you agree that they're like siblings? Depression, anxiety, addiction.
I mean, I would go further than that. Addiction is an attempt to deal with deep depression and despair, right? It's a very challenging.
Okay.
It's an extremely challenging sentence.
Have you ever seen an addict that wasn't in deep depression?
I mean, I would say by definition, if you are addicted, you are trying not to be present in your life because you're in very deep pain.
Got it.
That's what addiction is.
Got it.
There's a very challenging line. You know Marianne Faithfull, the great British rock star? She's kind of most famous because she used to go out with Mick Jagger, but that annoys me because she's much better than Mick Jagger. But anyway, she has a lot. She had a period in the 60s when she was homeless and addicted, and she had a heroin addiction. And it's just this line that's I remember the first time I read it thinking this is really challenging. I might be getting the wording slightly wrong. But she says, heroin saved my life because if it wasn't for heroin at that time, I would have killed myself. Which is extremely challenging. And I want to be clear, obviously, Marianne Faithfull is not saying heroin is a good solution to despair.
It kept her from committing suicide.
Exactly. That we've got to understand addictions happen for a reason. We tell these very simplistic stories about addiction, that it's primarily or entirely, it's a bit like, in the same way that the chemical imbalance story is a very simplistic way of understanding depression, there are real biological aspects, there are real brain changes, they are part of a big picture.
Yes.
I want to stress that. I'm not disputing that they're real. I talk about the reality of them. In the same way, we tell this very simplistic story about addiction, that it's primarily about the chemical hooks in the drug, right? So we think, we're sitting here in Manhattan, we're in Midtown. I used to live around the corner from here. We think if we kidnapped the next 20 people to walk down 7th Avenue and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, like a villain in a Saw film. At the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason, that there's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would desperately start to need.
Yes.
They'd have this incredible physical hunger. Chemical hooks are real, but they're actually a surprisingly small part of addiction. There's lots of evidence for this. I can tell you how, but there's an experiment that really transformed how we think about addiction, that I think helps us to see the shift in perspective we need to make. It's not enough evidence on its own. There's lots of other evidence. But so I learned it from the incredible man who did it, a man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who has changed the lives of many people. I spent a lot of time with him in Vancouver. So Professor Alexander explained to me this story we have, that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks.
Yes.
Comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your listeners can try them at home if they feel a bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself by overdosing within a week or 2. So there you go, right? That's our story. It makes perfect sense.
There it goes, yeah.
But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. It's just got the drug. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats. They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything that is meaningful to a rat, it's there in Rat Park.
Sounds like heaven, yeah.
Exactly, it's great fun.
Sex, cheese, and balls.
That's frankly my idea of paradise
exactly.
for rats. And they've got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. And this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they try both. They don't like the drugged water in Rat Park. They don't use it very often. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from 100% compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life meaningful, to none when they do have the things that make life meaningful. There's lots of human examples of this principle we can talk about, and a huge amount of scientific evidence. But to me, what this tells us is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, important though that is to many people.
Meaning.
It's connection. The opposite of addiction is connection, right?
Yeah.
My book is called Lost Connections because I think what we've done is we've lost our connection to many of the most basic things that we need as human beings. And that is placing us in profound distress and despair. And that distress and despair is not a biological malfunction, right? That's not... this is part of the problem. If you tell a story that is entirely biological... what you're saying to people is your pain doesn't mean anything. It's like a glitch in a computer program. And what I learned is your pain is profoundly meaningful. These are signals, right?
Yes.
We evolved these signals for reasons. And what we've done up to now is we've been insulting these signals, either by saying they're examples of individual weakness or by saying they're purely biological problems, or by just not listening to them at all. And what we have to start doing is stop insulting these signals and start listening to them, because they are telling us profoundly important truths about what's gone wrong with the way we live and how to fix it.
I feel so glad that we've come to this point, though, because do you remember back before you were a teenager and you started antidepressants, there was that whole period where it was so stigmatized, depression, you just kept your mouth shut.
Yeah.
You just don't, that was now, so if you were 18 when you started taking chemical antidepressants, that would have put us back in the, 90s?
Yeah, the late 90s.
Yeah. but before that, so what you went through was not good because, as you said in the book, you said that your doctor never bothered to even say to you, "Is there a reason you might be so distressed?"
Yeah, and I think
is there anything hurting you? Now that sucks what happened to you, but worse than that was the 10 years before that when it was still a stigma. There was a stigma attached to it. Don't you agree with that?
Yeah, stigma is a complete disaster. If you stigmatize your depression, it will get much worse. But I think it's really important to say, I misunderstood something really important about stigma for quite a long time. So I thought there were these, and a lot of people have been told there's these two ways of thinking about this. Either depression or addiction or anxiety are these individual weaknesses, moral flaws, obviously a disgusting way of talking, or they're purely biological problems, right? That's your choice. And actually, I thought the way out of stigma is you go, right, well, it's not an individual weakness. It's
a disease. It's a disease of the brain.
But actually, I interviewed a wonderful neuroscientist friend of mine, Professor Mark Lewis. I remember him saying to me, why do you think saying something is biological gets rid of stigma? No one ever doubted that AIDS was biological, right?
Right.
You might have noticed there was a lot of stigma about AIDS. No one ever doubted that leprosy was biological after the 16th century. You might have noticed there was a lot of stigma around lepers, right? Actually, there's pretty good evidence that this is not a particularly good way of ending stigma. The good way of ending stigma is to explain, actually, this is the depression and anxiety are largely, while there are biological components that are very real, this is largely a response to things that have gone wrong in our lives. Yes. And actually, the things that if you look at the 7 non-biological factors, they're making some of us depressed and anxious. They're making most people in this society feel worse, more unhappy than they need to be. And actually, rather than there just being a kind of biologically separate group of people for whom we need to ask kind of pity and sympathy, actually, when you understand the real causes of depression and anxiety, you can see that we are all united in a fight against these forces that actually make all our lives worse. So can I give a concrete example? Because that can sound a bit fancy and abstract. This is the loneliest society in human history.
Amen to that, There
is a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis?
3 a.m,
When they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none, right? Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well say nobody. What is life like if you feel nobody knows you well, right? And I spent a lot of time interviewing an incredible man who sadly just died. He was at the University of Chicago, Professor John Cacioppo. He was the leading expert in the world on loneliness. And he said, I remember him saying to me, why do we exist? Why are we alive? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They weren't faster than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive and survived because they live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. We are the first humans ever to try to disband our tribes. If you separate a bee from its hive, it will go crazy. It will go haywire. Look at it. If you think about the circumstances where we evolved, if you got separated from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for an extremely good reason. You were in terrible danger. Right? Those are the impulses we still have. So,
right, that's our biological makeup.
Yeah.
And you even talk about in the book, you talk about how when you were a little boy, isn't the story that you had lived in like a place where everybody knew each other and everybody parented each other's kids, and then you guys moved to, wasn't it Edgewater?
So my parents had lived in that.
Okay, so that was your parents.
So my dad grew up in a tiny village in the Swiss mountains. I don't want to over romanticize it. There are a lot of things wrong with that village. The way women were treated. My grandmother had a terrible life. I'm not being romantic about these things. There's a lot good. The things that are better now than they were then. But my dad grew up in a village. Was a very strong community. There were lots of other things wrong with it, but it was a very strong community. My mother grew up in a working class Scottish tenement, like kind of shared housing. Again, very strong community.
Everybody knew each other.
Yeah, when my grandfather died when he was very young, he'd worked on the docks, working class Scottish guy. There was a community to support my grandmother, to help her. When my grandfather was very ill, and he died very young. I never knew him, obviously. There was a community of people who helped my grandmother look after him, right? And by the time you get to, this is a pretty quick shift. By the time you get to when I'm born, I grew up in a kind of suburb of North London. It's called Edgware.
Yeah.
It's the end of the Northern Line for people who know London. I grew up in a place where I didn't know the names of any of my neighbours, right? I wouldn't know anyone who lived on our street. I was entirely normal in that respect. It's not a bad place. People in Edgware are lovely when you get to know them.
But you said home was your four walls.
Yeah.
Whereas for your grandparents, home was the community.
Exactly. That's a really good way of putting it. And if you think about, so one of the things I was asking, so when you think about loneliness, right? There is extremely strong evidence that loneliness causes depression and anxiety, and there is extremely strong evidence that loneliness has increased. So, helps us to understand one of the reasons why this crisis is going up. So, one of the things I was asking myself is, it's very important to me. I don't want to just diagnose the problem. I wanted to find solutions, right? So, a big part of what I started asking, let's think about it in relation to this one, is what's the cow for that problem? How do we solve it? And I discovered there's a wonderful solution that was pioneered. So one of the heroes of my book is an amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington. He's a doctor in East London, where I lived for a long time, a poor part of East London after I lived in Edgware. I lived in the East End of London. And Sam was really uncomfortable. He was a general practitioner, and he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they have some role to play. But Sam could see a few things very clearly. Firstly, most of his patients were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons, like they were really lonely. Secondly, he could see that while chemical antidepressants took the edge off, wasn't solving the problem for most of them. So one day, Sam decided to pioneer a different approach. A woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know pretty well later. Lisa had been shut away in her home with terrible depression and anxiety for 7 years, crippling depression and anxiety. One day when she came in, it was one of the only times she'd ever leave the house was to go to the doctor. Sam said to her, "Don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to prescribe something else." There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices. Can I swear on your podcast?
Sure.
Yeah, it was called Dog Shit Alley. That's what everyone called it, right?
Already swear. You already said a bad word.
And what did I say?
Did he say shit? What did he said a bad word. Yeah,
I'm constantly amazed by radio people who are capable of not swearing on air because I'm really
I don't.
bad at
You know why I don't? Because I have a lot of families who listen, and I always say, "Kids, it's not nice to swear, so forgive us." Yeah.
Okay, so this was called Dog Shit Alley. It was just a kind of scrubland.
Okay.
And Sam said to Lisa, "What I'd like you to do is come and turn out a couple of times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been quite anxious. We'll meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. And together, we're going to figure something nice to do together. So we won't be lonely and we'll have something meaningful to do." The first time the group met, Lisa literally vomited with anxiety. It was so much for her. But group starts talking. They're like, "What can we do together?" This is a group of inner city East London people like me. They didn't know anything about gardening. They were like, "We could turn Dog Shit Alley into a garden," right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I said it again. They decided they were going to learn gardening. So they started watching YouTube. They started reading books about it. They got from the library. They started to
gave them a purpose.
Yeah. Well, they
started
started
a reason.
They started to get their fingers in the soil.
Yeah.
They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. But something even more important happened. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't show up, they'd go looking for them. They did what we do when we're a tribe as human beings. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a small study in Norway of a similar program, which is part of a growing body of evidence that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants in moving people on the Hamilton scale. I think for
the bonding and giving people a group,
a gardening program.
Yeah. Okay,
a gardening program where people met as a group and gardened together. And I think for an obvious reason, right? It was dealing with some of the reasons why they felt so bad in the first place. And this, to me, this is something I saw, the principle of the cow, I think of it. I saw all over the world, from Sydney to San Francisco to Sao Paulo. The most effective strategy for dealing with depression and anxiety, the most effective strategies of different kinds, are the ones that deal with the underlying reasons why we feel this way. When did your depression end? It was when you changed your environment.
When I had a reason to wake up the next day.
Exactly.
Yeah,
when you got out of an environment
Yeah.
that made you feel bad and didn't meet your psychological needs and got into an environment that made you feel valued, enriched.
Well, also, it's like you say in the book, and I want to go through the nine causes and then your solutions, because I think they're fascinating. It was when I could see my future, because as you say in the book, a lot of depressed people, they can't see a future for themselves. There's no meaning to their lives. There's just no meaning. There's no reason for tomorrow, particularly. You said that, and I thought, bravo. I mean, what I thought was fascinating. Two things I loved about this book. I told you before we went on the air, I felt like I wasn't reading a book. I felt like I was sitting at a coffee shop, like you and I were old friends, and that you had gone off on a journey to interview all these people, and that you came back and we decided to meet over dinner or coffee, and you were telling me stories. So that was how the book felt to me.
Thank you.
I think that's a huge compliment. Like it just felt like you were just chatting with me.
Yeah, I worked really hard. You know, I was the first person in my family to go to school beyond the age of 16. Mm-hmm. You know, both my parents left school when they were 15. My grandparents left school most of them when they were 13. Yeah. And it's very important to me when I write my parents are intelligent people, but they never got a fancy education or anything. I always write thinking, could my mum and dad understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, right? Well, they get it. They feel
exactly.
it. Yeah,
so I work very hard at not simplifying, but work very hard at figuring out, okay, how do you explain this to... The worst thing anyone could ever say that I think about something is I didn't understand what this meant. Yeah. And I work really, really hard to make my writing comprehensible.
It was relatable. It was
thank
relatable.
You. That means a lot to me.
And that's why I'm not kidding. I'm not overstating this. I almost feel like it should be required reading for maybe like freshmen in high school. Because that's... I really believe that, because I think people you're either going to be in one of two groups in your life. You're either going to suffer with depression and anxiety, or you're going to know somebody who does, because it's so rampant. So that was one thing that I thought about your book. The other thing, I forgot what we were talking about. I was telling you what I love about this book. I forgot. If I don't think about it, I'll remember it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, though, was you said in the book, you emphasized that when you're talking about depression, you're not talking about unhappiness. You said they're totally different things, but there's a continuum. Can you elaborate on that?
So I used to think there were these two completely distinct things. You've got unhappiness and you've got depression. And the reason I thought that is because there is nothing more irritating or hurtful than when you are depressed.
Yes.
And people react like you're merely a little bit unhappy. So they go, hey, why don't we go out and see a movie? Why don't we? And you're like, right, you don't understand, I'm depressed, right?
Or when someone says, what have you got to be depressed about?
Right.
You have a roof over your head, you've got money, you've got children who are healthy.
So I think I can't come back to that, because I think it's a slightly separate thing that's going on there. But I used to say that, and that's what I thought. But when I looked at the evidence and interviewed kind of leading scientists on this, what I found is that is too simplistic a distinction. So it's more like all humans are on a continuum of happiness to profound sadness. Dr. Tyrrell Harris, who did some incredible research in the 70s, said
with George Brown.
A completely amazing man. She said to me,
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, she said to me, it was the best definition of depression anyone gave me. She said we've all had feelings of hopelessness, but depression is when that feeling of hopelessness spreads over your whole mind like an oil slick. And I really like that as a way of thinking about this. And it happens in response to many things. But
can I also say this? This just occurred to me. To me, the difference is unhappiness. Like I can have an unhappy day or an unhappy period of time, but depression is where those feelings feed off of each other. It's almost like they eat each other as food, and they keep growing and growing, and it permeates your whole life.
I would do the depression and unhappiness are different, but they're on a continuum. In the same way, if I fall over on 7th Avenue when I leave here, that's very different to falling off a cliff.
Yes,
but they're both forms of falling, right?
Okay.
And in a similar way, there's a continuum of ordinary unhappiness to depression. They exist on a continuum, but of course, depression is significantly worse. So I think that's important for people to understand. I think the other thing you're talking about, though, which is the kind of, and I get people saying this to me sometimes, it's something I thought about a lot in the research for the book. people say, okay, what about people who are depressed but have nothing to be depressed about? That's a phrase they'll use, right? And
it pisses me off. Yeah.
Well, one of the causes, I often say to them, I remember speaking to a guy here in New York, someone who's married to someone I know actually, who, not on this, a couple of times ago when I was in New York, him saying to me, he'd had very bad depression. And he said, but I had nothing to be unhappy about. And I said, tell me about what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, I had a job that paid $200,000 a year. I had a hot wife, and I had a really good car. And I said, but those are not basic human psychological needs.
That doesn't feed your your mind.
But this relates to a cause of depression and anxiety. One I found quite challenging because I could see how much this had played out in my own life.
And that's how other people judge it, by the way. The people who say to you, what have you got to be depressed about? They're looking at your condo, your income, your bank account, your body, your hair.
So everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? I say this with no sense of superiority. I love junk food. But there's equally strong evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. And I don't think we can understand this thing we're talking about, this people with nothing to be depressed about, in inverted commas, if you don't understand this. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like crap, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said.
Okay.
But no one had scientifically investigated this until an incredible man I got to know called Professor Tim Kasser about 27, 28 years ago. So he explained to me, every human being, everyone watching the show, everyone you've ever met who isn't in a coma, is a mixture of two kinds of motives. So imagine if you play the piano in the morning because you love it. And it gives you joy. And that experience is really meaningful to you.
It feeds you, yeah.
That's what's called an intrinsic reason to play the piano, right? You're not doing it to get anything out of it. It's just that's a moment you flow into that is important to you. Okay, now imagine you play the piano, not because you love it, but in a dive bar that you hate to pay the rent, or because your parents are massively pressuring you because it's their dream for you to be a piano maestro, or because you're going to post the clips on Instagram and you want to get the likes, right? That would be what's called an extrinsic reason to play the piano. You're not doing this thing because that experience is meaningful to you. You're doing it to get something out of it further down the line. Now, all human beings are a mixture of both kinds of motives. Those are called intrinsic and extrinsic motives, right? We're all a mixture of both. But Professor Kasser showed two really important things. Firstly, the more your life is driven by these extrinsic motives that I came to think of as a bit like junk food, the more...
I'm doing it for the gold star.
Exactly. The more you are doing it because of showing off, status, that kind of thing, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious. For all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that's not a way of living that meets your deeper needs, right? Think about my friend's husband. Is the fancy car meeting your deeper needs?
The hot wife of it, yeah.
Exactly. That even think about the way he thought about his wife. His wife is actually, I don't want to say too many details, I don't want to give away who they are, but his wife is actually an extraordinary person who does a job that massively affects the lives of really vulnerable people in amazing ways. That's not the thing he thought of when he thought about his wife. He thought about the fact that she's hot. She is hot. That's great. But he didn't think about her moral value. He didn't think about the
how
incredible,
close they are.
The quality of their relationship. He thought about the external quality that she's hot, right? So he showed, like I say, to end that, these two things. Firstly, the more that's how you think, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious, doesn't meet your needs. Secondly, he showed, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by these junk values.
And also what's true, you're just making me think of this, is when you stop getting the gold stars, when you stop getting the likes on Instagram, when you stop getting the accolades, when you don't get the response you're seeking from the outside world, then it kills you.
Yeah,
versus if it's intrinsic, your happiness just comes from doing it.
Yeah,
right?
That's a really good point, Tara. It's insatiable. The extrinsic...
There's never enough.
Think about... I don't want to alienate people listening to this, but think about the most powerful man in this country, right? This is a person driven profoundly by extrinsic values. He is
very much
to the degree that he evaluates his own daughter on the basis that he approves of her because she is hot, right? When she was 15, he said, said, well, I love my daughter, she's really hot, right? That's a very
that's a hard
peculiar
message
way of thinking
to give
about,
to your,
The implication being, if she wasn't hot, he wouldn't love her, right? I mean, think of Melania Trump went to speak here in New York at NYU years ago, and can't imagine why, and she was asked by one of the students, would you have married Donald Trump if he wasn't rich?
I know what she said.
And she said...
Can I say?
Yeah.
She said, if my memory, didn't she say, would he have married me if I wasn't good looking?
Exactly. Now think about what that reveals about, and I don't say so in a sense of superiority because we've all become more like this. I think that helps us to understand how these junk values make people more depressed. Because think about what Donald Trump and Melania Trump know in that moment. Melania Trump knows if she got fat, if she lost her looks, if she got burned in a fire, whatever it was.
God forbid. Yeah.
She's out God forbid, she's out the door, right? And Donald Trump in fact, Donald Trump was literally asked by Howard Stern, would you stay with Melania Trump if she was burned in a fire? And his answer was, do her tits get burned?
Ooh.
Now, think about what Donald Trump knows, there's if he loses his money, his status is success.
Very unstable. There's no grounding, and there's nothing to ground. Yeah,
exactly. Now compare that to say this separate to whatever you think about their politics, the relationship between Barack and Michelle Obama, who I'm sure would say, well, we'd love them, we'd love the other, even if we were homeless or burned in a fire, everything, right? Because they value something intrinsic in each other rather than this external shell. I use that not to make a cheap political point, and we can talk about politics if you want, but to make the point you can see Donald Trump is an expression of the change that's happened in the society. And think about, has it made him happy? He lives in a golden tower. He is indeed married to one of the most beautiful women in the United States. He is, in fact, the most powerful man in the world. Is he happy?
Who the hell knows?
I've rarely seen a more unhappy person than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's constantly scanning the environment.
I think he would say he's happy. I think he would say he's happy.
Well, I think
because I think his measure of happiness is different from ours.
Exactly.
I need deeper.
Yeah. Well, but you can see that it hasn't made him satisfied. You or I, if we were sitting in the White House, would not be constantly scanning Twitter for some random person who's insulted us, so we could scream back at them, right? That's not a sign of someone who is in fact satisfied or happy, right? Whatever else you might think about Trump, and there are perfectly decent people who support his policies, and we can debate that if you want. Although I'm sure you can guess my politics, but I don't want to diss his supporters, many of whom have good reasons to think the things they do. One of the things that was so interesting about what Professor Kasser discovered was actually relatively simple interventions can really undermine these junk values. He did an experiment with a guy called Nathan Dungham, just getting people to meet once every, and I really urge people listening and watching to try this, just meet once every couple of weeks. They got people to do this, adults and their teenage children, to talk about what they actually thought were meaningful values, moments they found meaning and connection in their lives.
You wrote about that, yeah.
And to figure out how they could spend more of their life pursuing those things and less of their life concerned with junk values, buying crap they don't need. What was interesting is just meeting once every couple of weeks for 4 months to discuss that and check in with each other led to a really significant scientifically measurable shift in people's values.
And this starts young. Like you talk about it in the book. And I applaud my friends who raise beautiful, wonderful children in this world today. Don't you applaud them? I mean, can you imagine what it is to raise a kid in today's world with everything coming at the child?
More 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name in this country, right?
Because of the visual.
So I remember thinking about this, because in some ways when I was learning what Professor Kasser taught me, I was both blown away and kind of, first I thought, this is kind of banal. It's kind of obvious, right? Everyone listening to your show knows they're not going to lie on their deathbed and think about all the likes they got on Instagram and all the shoes they bought. They're going to think about moments of meaning and love and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. From the moment
and
we're
when
born,
did you interview? This was within the last 5 years that you interviewed him, correct?
Yeah, it was about 4 years ago, 3 years ago.
Okay, so this is very because things are moving at even now things are so different than they were.
Well, even think about being here. Right? I remember thinking about this a lot when I lived here in New York. You can't go anywhere in New York. You can't get an elevator. You can't get in a taxi. I got a taxi here, a yellow cab. You can't even sit in a yellow cab without adverts being blasted at you, right?
When did you live here?
2011.
For about a year?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because to me, everything's changed so much. I mean, like, now things are not only different, but they're changing so fast. Everything is happening so fast. This is a different planet from 2011. Back in 2011, I had just kind of gotten on social media for the show, and now it's become so pervasive. And it's, like I said, children. I can't imagine what it is to raise children now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very close to my godsons and my nephews and my niece, and I think this environment we've created is toxic for us, but it's catastrophic for people.
I don't understand how their little brains make sense of it.
There's a metaphor I keep thinking of that. I'm trying to think if I remember this right. I didn't use it in the book, but so one of the effects of global warming is that the oceans are becoming subtly more acidic over time.
Acidic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because when CO2 carbon interacts with water, it causes a tiny fizz. That's why, when you drop things in, like a paracetamol or something. So that is happening all over the world. So it's making the oceans more acidic. But that's obviously bad for all sorts of reasons, but one of the big problems is the smallest creatures, not quite the smallest, but the creatures that need to form shells, as the water becomes more acidic, can't form shells. And it could cause a collapse.
Okay, so the ocean example, the ocean animals are I don't know if they're called
form shells.
Yeah,
and as the water becomes subtly more acidic, their shell literally can't form it. It dissolves as they're trying to form it. So this over time will be a real disaster. We're starting to see the effects of it now. But I remember thinking of that as an analogy for children, right? In this environment, even just things as weird as, if you look at the figures for how few children spend any time outdoors, right?
Oh,
it's extraordinary. Even like really, really basic
different
things.
World from when I was little.
Yeah. So again, I think we should be focused on solutions, but we need to understand that we're creating environments that don't meet our needs, don't meet our children's needs, and are kind of deeply problematic.
Well, let's talk about some of so part two of the book, all of part 2 of the book, detail the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that you've identified, and they're all based on disconnection. Again, so the book is called Lost Connections, and all of the 9 causes are based on disconnections. So again, you've already said that at the root of everything, all of these problems is just disconnection.
Some form of disconnection. Not all, I mean, it's probably the two biological ones, which are different, which are rooted in your biology. But can I tell you a story about...
Yes.
So I learned a huge amount from all these scientists and experts. But there was a place where emotionally all this fell into place for me. A place that
The place in Berlin?
Yeah. Can I tell the story about this?
Coty. Yes, tell the story. That was beautifully written.
Because it was there. These people are not scientists and doctors. And yet it was in Coty that I really felt like...
I see it. Well, because you saw it.
Yeah.
I observed you in the book.
Yeah.
Seeing it, you were, yeah.
Yeah. So to tell the story, in the summer of 2011, a Turkish-German woman called Nuria Cengiz climbed out of her wheelchair and put a sign in her window. She lived in a big anonymous housing project in Berlin, where no one really knew anyone else. And the sign in her window said something like, "I got a notice saying I'm going to be evicted from my apartment next Thursday, so on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself." People are walking past Nuria's window. They see this sign. No one knows anyone around here. It's like a housing project,
right?
Anywhere here in Manhattan.
And also lower income too, yes?
Yeah, it was a poor part of Berlin, a place called Coty. It's part of Kreuzberg, people who know Berlin. And, it was a particularly kind of poor part of the city where there were kind of, in this housing project, there were really only 3 groups of people who'd lived there. There were recent Muslim immigrants like this woman, Nuria. There were gay men and there were punk squatters, none of whom got along.
And they all kind of kept their distance from each other, and they were suspicious of one another. You emphasized in the book.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So people start to knock on Nuria's door. They're like, do you need any help? Nuria said, screw you, I don't want any help. She shut the door in their face. I'm going to kill myself. Shut the door. So people are standing outside the apartment, and they're all pissed off because everyone's rent has been going up and lots of people are being evicted. And they start talking, and this is, you might remember, the summer of the revolution in Egypt. One of them had just been watching it on the news and had an idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through Kotti into the centre of Berlin. And one of them said, if we just block the road for a day and we protest and, there'll probably be a bit of a fuss. The media will probably come. They'll probably let Nuria stay in her apartment. There might even be some pressure to keep our rents down. Why don't we do it? So it gets to the Saturday and they block the road. They build a little barricade, the people who live in Kotti, and they block the road. And Nuria's like, well, I'm going to kill myself. I might as well let them wheel me into the middle of the street.
Might as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So she goes into the middle of the road.
I liked her attitude, by the way, because she was like, what are you going to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Kill me. I'm going to do it Saturday or Wednesday. Yeah.
Exactly. That was exactly what she said, right? So Nuria sits there. The media do come. Nuria gives these slightly puzzled interviews. And it gets to the end. And it's a bit of a media thing in Berlin that day. And it gets to the end of the day. And the police turn up and they say, okay, you've had your fun. Take this down. It's over. But the people who live there said, well, hang on a minute. You haven't told Nuria she gets to stay. Actually, we want a rent freeze for our entire housing project. Mm-hmm. When we have those guarantees, then we'll take this down. But of course, they knew the minute they left, the police would just tear down this little makeshift barricade and that would be that. So one of my favourite people at Kotti, a woman called Tanya Gartner, she's one of the punk squatters.
Oh, the one with the mini skirt.
Yeah, she wears these tiny little mini skirts even in Berlin winter. She's quite hardcore, Tanya. She had this idea. In her apartment, she had a klaxon, those things that make loud noises in football, soccer matches. She went and got it. She came down and she said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drop a timetable to man this barricade. We are going to man it 24 hours a day until we got what we want. If the police come to take it down before we got what we want, let off this klaxon. We'll all come down from our apartments and stop them. So people who had never met, would never have met, start signing up to man the barricade. Very unlikely pairings. Yeah. So Nuria in her full hijab is paired with Tanya in a tiny little miniskirt. I think they got the Thursday night shift, if I remember right.
Now, you're there this whole time, like you're observing this.
I arrived after the beginning, but I arrived about a bit over a year into the protest. And I went there lots of times after that. So on the Thursday night shift, when it starts, Tanya and Nuria are like...
They're looking at each other like...
What have we got to talk about?
Yeah.
We couldn't be more dissimilar, right? As the nights went on, they start talking. They discovered they had something incredibly powerful in common. Nuria had come to Berlin when she was 16 from her village in Turkey with her 2 babies. And her job was to raise enough money for her to send back home for her husband who would come and join her. But after she had been in Berlin for 18 months, she got word from home that her husband had died. She'd always told people that her husband had died of a heart attack.
Yes.
Sitting there in the cold in Kotti with Tanya, she said something she'd never told to anyone in Germany. She explained that her husband had actually died of tuberculosis, which was seen as a kind of shameful disease of poverty. Yeah. That's when Tanya started talking about something she didn't talk about very much. She'd come to Kotti when she was 15. Her middle-class parents had thrown her out. She found her way to a punk squat in Kotti, and she got pregnant not long afterwards. They both realised they had been children with children of their own in this place that had so frightened them.
At the same age, almost.
Yeah, that they didn't understand. These pairings were happening all over Kotti. Directly opposite this housing project, there's a gay club called Südblock, run by a man I love called Richard Stein, who is a pretty hardcore gay club. To give you a sense of what it was like, the previous place he owned was called Café Anal. And
didn't they have transvestites in there?
Oh, loads of,
yeah.
I mean, a whole range of people, yeah. And when they'd opened this club, this is an area with a lot of very religious Muslims. At first, there'd been some resistance. In fact, their windows had been smashed. All sorts of things had happened. And when the protest began, they gave Zuidblok, this club, gave all their furniture to the barricade. They helped build it. And after a few months of the protest going on, they started saying to everyone, you could have all your meetings in our club. We'll give you free food. We'll give you free drinks.
They were so kind.
And at first, even the kind of left-wing people in Kotti were like, look, we're not going to get these very religious Muslims to come and have meetings in this really outrageous gay club. It did start to happen. As one of the Turkish German women there put it to me, we all realised we had to take these small steps to understand each other.
Toward each other.
Exactly, in the direction of greater understanding. And after the protest had been going on for a year, one day a guy turned up at the protest, arrived there unexpected, called Tuncay. So Tuncay was in his early 50s. And it's clear when you meet Tuncay that he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties. And he'd been living homeless. But he's got an amazing energy about him. And immediately everyone liked him. And he quite quickly became very popular with everyone.
He almost became like the mascot. Well, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And by then, the barricade that they had built had actually been turned into a permanent structure with a roof. Mm-hmm. And they were like, we don't want you to be homeless, they said to Tuncay. You should come and live in this thing we've built. So Tuncay started living in Kotti and he became a much, like you say, like a mascot, much loved. He would always lead.
They gave him a job at the gay bar.
Exactly. He was a much loved part of the protest movement. And after Tuncay had been there for, I think it was 9 months, one day the police came to inspect. They would do this every now and then. And Tuncay doesn't like it when people argue. He thought the police were arguing. So he went to try to hug one of the police officers. That's his way of calming people down. And the police thought they were attacking him, so they arrested him. That was when it was discovered. Tuncay had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital for 20 years, often literally in a padded cell. He'd escaped one day. He'd been on the streets for a few months and finally made his way to Kotti. So the police took him back to the psychiatric hospital, at which point the entire Kotti protest movement turned into a free Tuncay movement. They descend on this psychiatric hospital at the other side of Berlin.
They demanded his release.
Exactly. These psychiatrists are like, what is this? They've got this person they've had shut away for 20 years who hardly anyone ever saw. Mm-hmm. And suddenly they've got these very camp gay men, these women in hijabs and these punks demanding his release. And they're like, well, who are you? And I remember Uli Hartmann, one of the protesters there, who's a wonderful person. She said to them, yeah, but you don't love him.
We do, yeah.
Exactly. He doesn't belong with you. We love him. Mm-hmm. He belongs with us. And I remember thinking when Uli said that to me, how many of us, if someone carried us away, would have dozens and dozens of people saying, we look after this person.
Yeah.
We love this person. This person belongs with us. I mean, many things happen.
See, to me, that's a life. That guy, say his name?
Tuncay, yeah.
Tuncay has more. I don't have that. Yeah. I mean, my family's down in Florida. My family, I don't, in New York, I don't have that. So
I think you're totally right. And, I remember it took them a long time, but they got Tuncay back, right?
Well, yeah, and remember they said, okay, look, he has to have a permanent job and he has to have a place to live. He has to have proof of a place to live. So didn't they all chip in and get him a place to live?
And they said to the psychiatrists, if you knew Tuncay, you would know these were the last things he cared about. But if these are the conditions you impose on us, we will meet them. So they all chipped in. They got him a home.
And they got him a job at
the gay bar where he still works.
I'd work at the gay bar.
Yeah, anyone who goes to Berlin should go to Zuidblok and you can meet Tuncay. He's still there. And, they achieved many things. Not just they got Tuncay back. They got a rent freeze for their entire housing project. They then launched a referendum initiative to keep rents down across Berlin. Mm-hmm. It got the largest number of written signatures in the long history of the city of Berlin. But the last time I saw Nuria, I remember she said to me, look, I'm really glad I got to stay in my neighborhood. That's great. I gained so much more than that.
Oh, so much more than an apartment. Yeah.
Exactly. She was like, I was surrounded by these amazing people all along, and I would never have known. I remember one of the other Turkish...
That's the tribe you talk about.
Exactly.
Though. That's the tribe.
And that's the thing we're hungering for. One of the Turkish German women there, Neriman, you alluded to this before, said to me, when I grew up in Turkey, I grew up in a village, and I call my whole village home.
Yeah.
And then she said, I came to live in the Western world and I learned that what we're meant to call home is just our four walls. And then this whole protest began. And I started to call all these people and this whole place my home. And she talked about how she realized, in some sense, in this culture, we are homeless. The Bosnian writer Alexander Heyman said, home is where people notice when you're not there. By that standard, many of us are homeless, right? Or have a very small sense of home. And it was so...
Can I tell you something I thought about this?
Sure.
I live alone in my condo. Maybe you lived alone when you were in New York City. It's very common. A lot of us live alone.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
And I thought, I wonder, if I were to die in my condo, I wonder how long it would figure out, like the doorman would go, I wonder how long it would take the doorman to go, we haven't seen Tara in a little while, because there aren't that many people that I'm in contact with every single day.
That's an amazing
where it would go where somebody would notice I was missing. There are people I'm in contact with, but not every single day where if something happened, somebody would take notice.
There's a completely incredible documentary that I really recommend everyone watch. It's on Netflix called Dreams of a Life, which is a true...
Dreams of a Life?
Yeah, it's made by a friend of mine, Carol Morley. It's a documentary about a woman called Joyce. Oh, this is terrible. I've forgotten her surname. It's a true story. She died in her apartment in West London, not that far from where you lived. And her body was found 2.5 years later.
Oh, God.
When a skeleton was discovered in front of a television that was still playing, right? And Carol then went on this incredible journey to discover who this woman was.
Why did it happen?
And the story of this woman's life is, I don't want to give anything away, mind-blowing, right? So everyone should watch Dreams of a Life. But the
Dreams of a Life.
Yeah, it's incredible. But, you're so right. And I think it was so clear to me in Cottee, the truth of what these scientists have been telling me, right? I think about these people and how distressed they were. Nuria was about to kill herself.
Yeah.
Tunkai had been shut away in a padded cell for 20 years.
As though something was wrong with him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Loads of these people were depressed and anxious. In the main, they did not need to be drugged. They needed to be together. They needed a tribe.
Well, they were depressed and anxious when they were alone.
Yeah.
When you put them all together, their problems
were solvable.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
Yeah.
And I remember Tanya saying to me, one day I sat outside Zublock with her, and she said to me, when you're all alone and you feel like shit, you think there's something wrong with you. But what we did is we came out of our corner crying and we started to fight. And we realised we were surrounded by people who felt the same way. And to me, this is the most inspiring thing about Cottee. I think you can tell I love these people. I think they're amazing. But in one sense, they are not exceptional, right? They are random people who happen to be united the fact they lived in one place where the rent kept going up. This hunger for reconnection is all around us.
And belonging.
And belonging. Yes. This desire for us to build a home together is all around us.
That's what Cottee was about. Belonging to a group and having safety in there, and then having meaning. They all had a reason.
Meaningful values. Exactly.
Well, they had a reason. They had something to look forward to tomorrow.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you final thoughts because in the book, we'll wrap now. I want to give my Tara Marie's tip. In the book, after you list all these, all the types of disconnection, and when you read it, you go, like it's stuff that when you read it on paper, you recognize it, and it's stuff that I wonder if we knew about. Does that make sense? Like when you read it on paper, you recognize it as though it was somewhere already in the back of your mind.
But this is one of the really weird things, Tara, about learning this stuff and then talking to people about it. In some ways, although there's lots of science people won't know, lots of stories people don't know, I feel like what I'm doing is giving people permission to know the things they know in their hearts.
They already know. Yeah, because you recognize it.
But then what's happened is, and it goes back to where we were at the start, I remember doing an interview for the book. So before the book came out, I thought most likely response is people are going to go, no shit, Sherlock, right?
Actually, no, I found it really insightful because I never thought about it.
But it was so weird because I remember when the book came out, I was expecting people to go, yeah, this is really obvious. And I kept being introduced in interviews where they go, and now we're going to talk to Johann Hari, who's written this incredibly controversial new book. I remember doing an
groundbreaking,
yeah, and
revolutionary.
I remember doing an interview with here in the United States on the radio, where I was talking about how loneliness causes depression. One of the most obvious things. If you'd asked my grandmother or your grandmother, does loneliness cause depression? They would have looked at you like you were an idiot.
Yeah.
And the interviewer said to me, and never forget this, said, this is a really controversial argument. And I thought, how did we get to the point where the most obvious point is regarded as controversial? But what's happened is these biological stories, which have some truth in them, have driven out these much more obvious insights and instincts that we have.
Right.
And I think what we need to do...
Our needs.
Exactly. That's exactly right. What we need to do is reconnect people with a sense of their own needs, which they know at some level, because their bodies are signaling this to them, right? That's what this is. Depression, I think, is a form of grief for your own needs not being met, right?
That's beautiful.
We need to hear that signal. We need to stop insulting that signal.
And depression is a gift if you look at it like that, because it's your clear signal, ding, 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 something is terribly, terribly wrong.
Yeah, it's agony. But in the same way, if you put your hand on a burning stove, that will be agony, but that is a really useful signal. You'll get your hand off the stove. If you didn't receive that, people with leprosy doesn't actually make your fingers fall off. What happens is it numbs the pain receptors. So that means that you don't notice if you're being burned or if your hand's being stuck in a car or whatever. And that's why, you can lose parts of your body, right? In a similar way, if that pain signal is a necessary, you can think of it as a gift.
It's a gift, yeah.
It is protecting you. Your pain signal protects you. It will get you back to a place of safety. This pain signal that we're experiencing as a society, frankly...
We're just drugging it.
Yeah. Or pathologizing it. And I want to stress again, I'm not against giving people drugs. There's some value in giving people drugs of any kind, not just chemical antidepressants. But precisely because the causes are much deeper than the biology, there are biological causes that contribute to this. But because the causes are much deeper, the solutions need to be much deeper. And I've been to the places where they're pursuing.
Simple, don't you? I mean, they're simple. Most of them are free. Most of the solutions that you talk about are free.
Think about Lisa in that gardening program. There's a $10 billion industry to tell Lisa that she's depressed because there's a problem in her brain. And there's a $0 billion industry in telling her, you might want to go gardening with some people who'll love you and care about you. I mean, maybe not $0 billion industry, could maybe Home Depot make some money from selling her some plants. But it's not that much money, right?
Right.
But you can see how we've ended up with this hyper-capitalist society, and there's some value in markets, of course. But we've ended up with this hyper-capitalist society where the only stories that we can tell, the only solutions we can offer are the ones that lead to people getting profit, right?
So sad.
And there are other stories. Now, I'm not against markets in all cases. The pursuit of profit can be healthy in some cases. But if that becomes everything in our lives, that debases us as human beings. It reduces us to so much less than we actually are.
We've screwed up our value system so badly, and that is the result of it. And so that's the result of it, and the result of it is the way we're behaving and the way we're operating our lives.
Yeah, and if you screw up your value system as badly as we have, you end up with a society where people can't interpret their own pain meaningfully. And, Krishnamurti, the great Indian writer, and philosopher, said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
You have that line in the book. That's brilliant.
I think about that all the time, right?
Say it again.
It's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Brilliant.
And something's gone wrong with our culture, but we can fix it. And I would just say as the last thought, because we've talked about some very big things that can be really daunting to people. When I think about, okay, we're up against some big forces, I think about a friend of mine who I wrote about a bit in the book, Andrew Sullivan. He's a journalist, brilliant journalist. Lots of people will know his work. In 1994, Andrew was diagnosed as HIV positive. It's the height of the AIDS crisis.
I love this story.
It's the height of the AIDS crisis, and there's no solution in sight.
This is all in London, yes?
No, this was he was living in DC at the time.
Okay.
He was the editor of the New Republic at the time, kind of prestigious political magazine. his best friend Patrick had just died of AIDS, right? There were no protease inhibitors. There was nothing at that time. They were on the horizon, but people didn't know that then. And Andrew was like, okay, it's a death sentence. I'm going to die in the next few years. And he decided to go to Provincetown, a little town in Cape Cod that I know well, to die. And he decided before he died, he was going to do one last thing. He was going to write a book about a crazy utopian idea that no one had ever written a book about.
Totally radical.
Ludicrous.
Yeah.
I'm never going to live to see this happen.
What the hell?
No one alive. No one was ever going to live to see this happen. But someone somewhere down the line might pick up this idea. The idea he wrote the first ever book advocating was gay marriage. And when I get depressed and I think, God, we're up against these big forces, I try to imagine going back in time to 1994 to Provincetown and saying to Andrew, okay, you're not going to believe me, but
check this out. Yeah.
24 years from now, point one, you will be alive. That would have seemed
he's still alive.
inconceivable. He's alive and well.
Thank God. Yeah.
Point two, and still writing amazingly. Point one, you'll be alive would have seemed impossible. Point two, you'll be married to a man. That would have been impossible. It seemed impossible. That'll be legal. Point three, I will be with you when the Supreme Court of the United States quotes from this book you're writing now, when it makes it mandatory for every state in the United States to introduce gay marriage. And the next day, you will be invited by the President of the United States to a White House that will be lit up in the colours of the rainbow flag to have dinner with the President to celebrate what you and so many other people have achieved. Oh, and by the way, that President, he's going to be black.
Yeah.
Every aspect of that would have sounded like crazy science fiction. I mean, saying, so Tara, 24 years from now, a transgender president is going to invite us to the Oval Office to smoke crack with her, right? Like, not that that's what we want. I mean, the transgender president, yes, the crack, no. But it would have, I mean, it would have sounded ridiculous. It happened, right? Andrew is alive. He saw it happen. We all saw it happen. Everyone listening to your show and watching it has lived through incredible transformations, right? The women don't need me to mansplain this to them, but my grandmothers weren't even allowed to have bank accounts of their own when they got married, right? Think about the transformation. Now, we've also lived through some bad changes, as people who've watched the news in the last few years will have noticed. But, you know, incredible changes are possible when we band together and fight for them. Everyone listening to your show is so much more powerful than the story this culture tells them. We are all capable of incredible changes. The transformation in how gay people are treated,
thank God,
it didn't happen by, magic. It didn't happen because people blew things up.
Because you banded together.
It happened because people banded together in a spirit of love and compassion. They appealed to other people's goodness and decency, and the hearts of people all over this country and all over the world were opened. We can do it again.
And we can fight and we can get past the depression, I hope.
We can deal with the things that are making us feel so bad. There are solutions. I have seen them in practice all over the world. Those solutions are waiting for us to pick them up. And the fact that we are surrounded by so many people who are depressed and anxious and so many more people who are being made unhappy by these factors should be empowering. Because in fact, it's just waiting for us to articulate it. The fact that it touches so many people, far more people are being affected by this stuff than were affected by homophobia, right? We can actually build coalitions more easily and more powerfully when so many people are directly affected.
Do you like my idea about this being recommended reading?
Yeah,
or not even required reading. Do you know what I mean? Like required reading.
I don't want to force anyone to read my book, but you can.
No, but I think teenagers. I would like.
Yeah, lots of teenagers have been reading it, and it's really moving to get their emails and in the Instagram seems to be their main way they message.
Yeah, this is a brilliant, beautiful book. I want to give my Tara Marie's tip every at the end of the show. I always give a little tip that usually relates to.
Great.
What the show jogged in me. And because I suffered terribly with depression, I thought of this, and I think I don't know if you may corroborate this. I don't know what your experience has been, but my first memory of feeling depressed was when I was 14. So I'm 53, almost 54 now. So and off and on over the 40-year period. And you know how depression is. You'll go in and out of periods. So it's not like I had it once and then I was done. For me, when I get depressed, everything starts to really slow down. I slow down mentally, I slow down physically, and I withdraw into what I would call hopelessness. just absolutely feeling hopeless. And I find that these feelings feed on themselves and they just keep getting worse if I don't do something to break the cycle. So a lot of tools have helped me. And ironically, it's a lot of tools that you mentioned in the book, connecting with nature, connecting with other people. They help me. But one of the things that really has helped me the most is exercise. And for me, what I find is it helps me fix the disconnect between my brain and my body. Because when I go into depression, those two splinter off. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they splinter off. I get really in my head. So the exercise reconnects my body and my brain. And what it does is I feel like it brings me back into my body. It brings me back into the present moment, because when I'm exercising, I have to be here now. And it shifts something inside of me on a chemical level. And what I want to tell people is I find that for me, really intense bursts of exercise help me the most, because I always say, and you may like this, depression can't catch a moving target. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like, depression cannot catch you if you're a moving target. So what I do is I get outside. For example, I'll get outside and I'll run down by the Hudson River like I'm being chased by a tiger for even just as little as 8 to 10 minutes. But it jolts my body because it's as intense as I can. It jolts my body, it jolts my brain, and it just floods my brain with endorphins. And I've noticed when I do this, it's impossible to feel depressed when I'm moving vigorously. Have you ever tried that? It's impossible. Yeah. It's impossible, because part of being depressed for me is to kind of, slow down physically. It's impossible to feel depressed when I'm sprinting or working out really hard, and the after effects are long lasting. So if I do it consistently, it can actually keep me from falling into a depression. So my tip is, the next time you're feeling depressed or you feel yourself kind of sliding into a depression, because there's that period where you can feel it coming, give intense exercise a try. And by intense, I just mean whatever's intense for you. Walk as fast as you can, bike as fast as you can, swim as fast as you can. Just do it really intensely. And even short bursts of exercise will alter your physical and mental state. And then if you do it with regularity, it'll have a continued benefit. Have you ever tried that?
Yeah, there's good evidence that exercise is...
because I'm an exercise physiologist.
Yeah, there's very good evidence for that.
So fascinating stuff. And again, for me, it's not the length of the exercise, it's the intensity of it, because it gives me a jolt. That is all for today. If you're hearing this episode as a podcast and you want to watch the show, go to youtube.com/Tara Marie Live.
Oh, I should say, Tara, that my publicists always tell me off if I don't say this. Anyone who wants any more information about the book, where to get the book or the audiobook, or wants to take a quiz to see how much they know about the real causes of depression and anxiety, go to www.thelostconnections.com. You can also listen...
The Lost Connections?
Yeah, because it turns out Lost Connections was the name of a Canadian band years ago, and they owned the website and wanted a fortune for it. Also, you can listen to audio of huge numbers of the people that we've talked about in this podcast. Scientists, experts, everyone in Coty, loads of people. So yeah, you can listen to that at thelostconnections.
I'm glad you gave me that, because she gave me a different website. I'll say that now. Yeah. Go to, if you want to see this video, if you're hearing it as a podcast, go to youtube.com/Tara Marie Live, search for the video entitled Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression. You can also access my YouTube channel on my website, TaraMarie.com. I want to thank my wonderful guest, Johann Hari. For more information, again, about his work, thelostconnections.com. Go to thelostconnections.com, thelostconnections.com. Get a copy of his book. This is a brilliant book, available now in hardback wherever books are sold. And Lost Connections in paperback will be available June 23rd of this year, 2019, wherever books are sold. Please rate and review Tara Marie Live on iTunes, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can subscribe using iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Just go to it and search Tara Marie Live, and you can find all episodes of Tara Marie Live on my website, TaraMarie.com. And while you're there, sign up for my mailing list. You'll get my newsletter with all my Tara Marie's tips about fitness, nutrition, and motivation. And I do always send out information about the latest episode of the show. Connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at Tara Marie Live, and on Twitter at TaraMarie_live. Make better choices today than you did yesterday, and you'll always be moving in the right direction. Thank you to Johann Hari, this beautiful book. Peace out, everybody.